Sorcerer's nerfed? Ha! What nerf?
Okay, yes, completing the capstone at like level 54 for Torment isn't the craziest thing in the world, especially if you're a rogue, Necromancer, or Druid. But to say it's a sorcerer and it's using the incomplete version of the build I'm about to present the perfected version of, I'm fairly chuffed.
Hello, my fellow sorcerers, and welcome to my first Season 1 Magnum Opus. I am very pleased and proud of this creation that goes... Do I want to use Frozen Orb? Do I want to use Blizzard? Oh, do I want to use Ice Spikes? I don't know. What about Ice Shards? How about all of them, all at once, all of the time, annihilating everything in an endless wave of apocalyptic, permanently freezing, infinite mana, undying ice that lets you, yes, do the Capstone dungeon at level 54, and that lets you, yes, immediately go into tier 21 Torment Nightmare dungeons at that low level, and then, yes, continue blowing through Torment content so you can level as fast as possible and generally grind all of the things you need as fast as possible until you get to ultra late game, when you have perfect ancestrals with the ideal affixes to explore other options. But even then, this build remains arguably still the best way to sorcerer. The speed, the safety, the raw damage output, the combination of everything that it does is unmatched, even compared to a lot of the other classes' options. And make no mistake, this is not an Ice Spikes build. This is a Blizzard build. It uses a combination of some buffed synergies, Malignant Hearts, and something that might be just a little bit broken, but I don't care, I will take it, because Sorcerer needs all the help it can get, and that help is me!
Okay, sorry, I got carried away there. I don't think I'm anything that special. I just like this class and like telling you guys the kind of ways that I've come up with playing it.
Anyway then, I really can't recommend this enough. It just feels fantastic to play, it's incredibly quick, and again, to really stress, so shockingly tanky for Sorcerer. The fact I'm not being one-shot constantly in Torment Nightmare dungeons this high above me, this early on, without the Paragon board extended, without the various mitigations that we usually have or used to have in the preseason, it's surprising. Outside of, you know, walking like a dumbass into an exploding fire enchant death.
Oh no!
Basically, the bottom line, it is not possible to have a more powerful build or an easier time to Season 1 as a Sorcerer before perfect min-max ultra late game builds than this right here. So let's get into it, and for once we're not going to start with skills, I'm going to start by explaining a little interesting broken mechanic that lets Blizzard, pure Blizzard damage, be the star of this build, with everything else supporting it. So as you know, Blizzard counts as damage over time. It is a dot spell, like a Firewall, which means it is affected by a certain Malignant Heart. Creeping Death. Your damage over time effects are increased by 40% for each crowd control. So you stun them with Raiment, that's another 40%. You freeze them, that's another 40% up to 80. You slow them with a lucky hit, now it's 120, and so on and so forth. And you can see how this can ramp to crazy levels. But chill also counts, and Blizzard chills. So unlike Flame Wall, just casting Blizzard gives itself immediately a 40% damage increase. But what is interesting is that every new Blizzard you stack on top counts as a separate instance of chill. At least that's the leading theory from the testing. Whatever is actually happening, the result is the same. Every new Blizzard you manage to stack on the enemy before they freeze is another 40% damage. So here, if I stack the Blizzards without actually anything on, we end up after 3 Blizzards ticking for sort of 2,000 while they're frozen, or 1,500 while they're not. Okay, cool. And by the way, Blizzard, I swear, didn't used to stack damage, so even that interaction is interesting. But if we then equip the Creeping Death and start stacking it up, very quickly, as you saw just there, he started ticking for 2,300, which is already 800 higher than it was before. But you can just keep going. Now it's ticking for 4,500, and then we just keep on going until we run out of mana. And every single cast exponentially amps the damage, and if you go for long enough, you start having Blizzard ticks for 10k, 15k, 20k, and it's a little bit broken in the best, most beautiful of ways. So as soon as I figured out that was actually working, when I swapped from Firewall just on the off chance to see how Creeping Death would affect the other Ground Zone damage over time spell, I had this sort of revelation. Okay, forget everything. We need to do a hard Blizzard damage Creeping Death because that is silly. How can we make that complete and as powerful as possible? And well, this is how. By starting properly, finally, with the skill tree. A couple points in your basics, just to move on and get to your cause, where we kinda go a little bit crazy. This is both our enchantment slots. First, we get Frozen Orb, max it out, and take it to Greater for that vulnerable application. This always makes frozen enemies vulnerable. And because we are, of course, spamming Blizzard, which is constantly freezing enemies, then this is being sent out in the enchantment slot by every single cast of everything that you do, the buffed 30% chance. It's now ticking on enemies that are frozen, making them vulnerable, amping your damage, doing loads of damage itself, but on top of that, when we eventually get down to here, this triggers Frigid Breeze like nothing else. Frozen Orb lucky hits crazily, in much the similar way that Ball Lightning does. So you fire out the Frozen Orb, it stops moving, makes the frozen enemy vulnerable, fills up your mana, does a load of damage, and then says goodbye, thank you, I'll be back later. And by God, is he a hero of this setup. It really is full frost, and it's very cool. Anyway, Ice Shards! Yes, of course we want that for the auto-casting, throwing them at our frozen enemies, of which they are all of the time everywhere. It's extra damage, and it also helps, you know, with crits and lucky hits and all of that good stuff, and that makes a really solid foundation here to play off with your enchantments. And it adds a ton of damage too, on top of the damage over time. You get the best of both worlds with this build, big burst, and just constant, consistent melt. Then the defensives, yes! Flame Shield to Shimmering, as we do, Teleport to Shimmering, as we do, and then we'll grab Enhanced Ice Armor just for that little bit of extra mana regen. You might have to tool yourself how much mana regen you need, depending on how good the affixes on your gear are at the stage that you get this. This is quite a mana-friendly build, as you've been seeing from well, demo dungeons in the background, though on single target you might find yourself running a bit low, so this does help with that. Then we get Frost Nova for more vulnerable, and because Frost Novering a group of enemies after you've Raiment pulled them in with the Ice Shards enchantment is just an icy bomb of doom. One rank into Elemental Attunement just so it can happen, and then it will fairly frequently, and then we go down to here, get as much lucky hit as possible because we want as much lucky hit synergy to happen, and then we go over to here, get just one rank of protection so we have barriers up consistently, and then the buffed mana shield for that essentially permanent 21% damage reduction. Then we get to the star of the show, Blizzard, and you want to get mages so it lasts as long as possible. Your goal here always is just layer as many blizzards as possible over the enemy and then amp the damage up with Creeping Death. We then go down and get the quartet of Frost build boosters. All of them are good. More damage to elites, more damage to chilled and frozen, the mana restore that powers everything, and then more damage to vulnerable. Thanks to Frozen Orb enchant, they're always vulnerable. Then we get our ultimate Deep Freeze with the buffed Supreme that resets your cooldowns, which is so important and useful, especially with the cooldown reduction nerf, and we'll get to that when we talk about actually playing it. Lastly then, we use Avalanche for 2 reasons. The damage boost and the mana cost reduction, because they're the 2 things that it does. But, okay, to not be coy, normally Avalanche is there to help with mana. The damage increase isn't super needed, or at least the reason you take it. It's a nice bonus, but you take it when you need mana help. However, because we're doing this crazy interaction with Creeping Death and Blizzard stacking, you do want your next Blizzards to have 40% increased damage, and you really do want to have free Blizzards, specifically on single target. On AoE, thanks to Frozen Orb and Frigid Breeze, you'll be fine, but on single target, Avalanche comes in clutch. Eventually, you might go to Shatter with something like this, but then it starts to turn into a different build that isn't about Blizzard damage, so Avalanche really does cap us off here. And that's, well, that. This is what your bars will end up looking like, and it's very straightforward. Every group of enemies, just start layering Blizzards. The Frozen Orbs will fly, the Ice Shards will fly, and you will fly as you just power through the dungeon, moving through, and just blowing everything up incredibly quickly with both massive dot damage, massive burst damage, massive CC, and you just don't have to worry about a thing. Now, against single target, this is where there's at least a little bit of a technique, because we do run prodigies for that burst of mana. Our other main source of mana regen will come from Umbral and restoring mana when we freeze, stun, etc. enemies. That also helps on top of Frozen Orb and the passive in groups, but against bosses, that's why Umbral is here. And because Deep Freeze actually resets all your cooldowns, against bosses, you're going to be spending all your mana layering, then you're going to pop all of your defensives to get as much mana back as possible, then pop Deep Freeze, instantly leap Deep Freeze, resets all your cooldowns, press them all again, layer even more, and then you start to get some serious amped damage. It works wonders. And lastly, like with Firewall, you will really be surprised how few Blizzards you need before everything is definitely going to die before you can move on. You don't need to go crazy layering too many. It's really that effective how fast and potently it amps up with Creeping Death, along with Ice Shards flying at them, along with Frozen Orbs flying at them, and along with, yes, Ice Spikes exploding, as we do use Ice Spikes on top of this. It's not needed. I did the Capstone dungeon and the early Nightmares without it, but it helps a lot on tanky elites and bosses, and is certainly worth mixing in here to just go full ice. So let's have a look at our aspects then. Avalanche is the obvious choice, as we want as many amped damage Blizzards that cost 0 mana as possible. And you'll notice that this really is why it's not an Ice Spikes build with some Frosty enchants, because normally Blizzard exists just to summon the Ice Spikes, but here the Blizzard itself is the main source of the damage, and the reason why we do have so many ranks in it, and that awesome interaction with Creeping Death that lets the whole thing work. It's really lovely. In any case, then, we want Ice Shards Piercing, so the enchantment can cleave through ranks of enemies as much as possible. Then to our mana look-afters, we have Prodigies on for single target, and then Umbral for groups of enemies, and in both cases it keeps us topped up nicely. Now, I have played without Prodigies in this, and it still flows really well and feels fine, but it does give you that little extra boost, which can smooth out bad luck on lucky hits, and prevents you from going completely dry. Then we whack the Ice Spikes Explodey on our amulet, so it gets that 1.5 times, and that just adds a nice bit of passive damage, and alongside both enchantment slots means that your crit isn't going to waste, and actually crit becomes important and powerful, and that's one of the really cool things about this build. Damage over time can't crit. But Ice Spikes can crit, Ice Shards can crit, and Frozen Orb can crit. So we're getting the best of both worlds. We get to dip into that valuable crit damage bucket on 3 of our 4 methods of dealing damage, while also dipping into this maybe bugged way of Wrathful Heart Creeping Death interacting with Blizzard's chill dot damage. It's really, really fantastic. Then on our helmet, I don't have an aspect currently because, well, you need to choose one of 2. Either you put on Frost Blitz for double Frost Nova, and you, well, use that for all the reasons you would, more cooldowns, more freeze, more vulnerable, or if you are feeling a little bit squishy, actually in this you want to think about Snow Guard, taking % less damage in your own Blizzard. You always will be, and this is really noticeable in how much tankier it makes you. So depending on how you're feeling, choose one of those 2. Then you want, as every sorcerer forever and always will always have and want, Raiment of the Infinite in your chest slot. If you don't have it yet, that's not the end of the world, but it does massively amp this build. I've had 3 of them drop so far, and everyone is reporting uniques are dropping much more frequently, so you will likely get one soon. Otherwise, just have a chest with a defensive aspect of your choice. But the teleport AoE stun obviously is an extra amp of Creeping Death, as it's an extra form of crowd control, and then grouping everyone up in the center of your Blizzard for all of the goodness is, of course, ridiculously potent. On your gloves, you want the Frozen Orb aspect so that it does stay in place and explode. That's what powers the lucky hit, the vulnerables, and makes it actually worthwhile as an increase. On your legs, you want Disobedience, because of course you do, we need all the armor we can get. And then finally, Esu's Heirloom is nice, it's not required. You can get Shared Misery, or you can get Binding Embers for Immobilize on your Flame Shield, which is an extra stack of Creeping Death. It really is up to you. I like the movement speed of just clearing faster, and I like the extra crit chance for the 3 aspects that can crit here. So that's kind of where this is at then, and I'm in an awkward position, to say the least, that I have this massively improved damage on this wand I found, but I don't have a second copy of Avalanche yet, so, some of the footage you have been seeing is with this swapped without Avalanche on, and I've still been fine and not running out of mana, so it has worked okay and functioned, so you perhaps can argue that you don't need it. You could get your Ice Spikes affect a wider area, you could get yourself more damage with a barrier up, and so on and so forth, but it's a nice, comforting, and damage boosting because of the boost to Blizzard, which is being crazy boosted by Creeping Death, so I would definitely recommend it. Then when we look at actual affixes that we're after, that's a little bit trickier because you're going to be replacing gear fairly quickly as you go through Sacred into Ancestral, but generally speaking, you want cooldown reduction, you want mana cost reduction, resource gen, more max mana, anything mana related, ranks of Blizzard, ranks of defensive skills, crit chance, vulnerable damage, lucky hit chance, and crit damage. Everything else after that is just what you can get, general damage ups. So that about does it. Let's look at hearts. To start with, you want this Brutal Heart of Revenge. It's just too good to ignore, especially on Sorcerer when we're so defensive skill focused. A huge bit of mitigation, up to 20%, and then free explosions of damage for our troubles. And it is fire damage, which, yes, along with Flame Shield, gives you your 3rd stack of Tel Rashers, which we still want to take for a free up to 30% damage bump, as we have seen here, the best version of this you can get. And then, yes, as I've been talking about it, Creeping Death is your Wrathful Heart of choice to make Blizzard stack to crazy heights, thanks to how it interacts with Chill and multiple Blizzards layered on top of each other. So for Paragon, start with your first board, because you have to, and then follow my path up as such, and then in your first glyph slot you are going to grab Elementalist. This will buff the non-physical damage node here, which is really good. It is such a good amp for Sorcerer, but more importantly it acts as a mini Telrashes for another 15% damage on top. We're always spamming those 3 damage types, especially with the Brutal Heart of Revenge, so this becomes a really good glyph, especially in this playstyle. Then we move up and get the Icefall board, which you do eventually want to grab this legendary node. It's very good defensively. In fact, you will end up wanting a lot of this board, but for now the priorities are thus: getting the Polar Rime cluster, moving over and getting the Frost cluster, going straight up and getting the Frigid cluster, and then in your next glyph slot you want Control. Now, activating it does need you to have this leveled up, so it's got a bigger range, which is unfortunate. There is an argument to be made. You can start with Control down here. It's kind of here and there. It's about equivalent. These are your first 2 glyphs. Which way round is sort of up to you, but when you can, get the extra bonus for that 20% damage to Stunned or Frozen, which enemies always are, and it is a huge help. Oh, and if you're wondering, we don't get the Adept glyph that makes a Blizzard a larger area, because we want our ice spikes to be concentrated in a smaller area as it's higher damage, and ice spikes are here for single target bosses, and they just stand in your blizzards anyway, so it's just not a necessary glyph to use at the moment, especially as we have no aspect room for the ice spikes exploding in a wider range. So that's kind of it then. Everything you need to know to play Blizzard Ice Shards Frozen Orb Ice Spike Sorcerer, the greatest of all sorcerers, at least as far as the realm of ice is concerned, and it does get to use my favorite ultimate, which is also phenomenal. Let me know what you think, let me know if you use it, and I wish you well in doing so. For now then, like if you've enjoyed this, subscribe and hit the bell for more, consider supporting the future of the channel on Patreon down below, and until we meet again, a goodbye.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.